Healthcare is on the ballot. Education's on the ballot. Student loans are on the ballot. Your next job is on the ballot, whether it's here or whether it's in China, it's on the ballot. And you got one vote, a kind of prayer that you get to cast over the character of the individual who will say, I don't want what just happened to them to happen to anybody else.
Hey, I'm Ashley Jackson, and this is Push the Next Generation, your Gen Z coded guide to power and politics. Today, we're decoding the U.S. Constitution. So our first episode is launching the day before the U.S. presidential election. It's giving thoughts and prayers as we navigate the anxiety of it all. But it was precisely for that reason that it also felt like the perfect time to dive in with you all. So each week, I'll be giving you news highlights, and then we'll get into some fun interviews. This week saw significant political developments both domestically and globally. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau faced mounting pressure from his own party amid calls for his resignation following the recent Saskatchewan election where the NDP leader conceded defeat, signaling a demand for change. We are also seeing concerning incidents of election interference in the United States, with ballot drop boxes set on fire in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, destroying hundreds of ballots and prompting investigations. The Supreme Court ruled on Wednesday to allow Virginia to remove at least 1,600 people from its voter rolls before Election Day, overturning a lower court decision. This ruling effectively bypasses a federal law that prohibits large-scale voter purges close to elections, with all three liberal justices dissenting. The decision potentially opens the door for other states to conduct last-minute voter removals, raising concerns about voter suppression through legal maneuvers. On the campaign front, former President Trump held a controversial rally at Madison Square Garden, cited for racist remarks, while Vice President Harris campaigned with high-profile supporters like former President Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen, giving her closing arguments at the ellipses where Trump gave his precursory speech to the January 6th insurrection. Internationally, tensions escalated in the Middle East with an Israeli airstrike in Lebanon, resulting in the deaths of 3 journalists, and ongoing disputes over election results in the country, Georgia, led to protests. Additionally, Brazil reached a historic $23 billion settlement with mining firms over a devastating environmental disaster from 2015, highlighting ongoing global concerns about corporate accountability and environmental protection. As for election night in America, Vice President Kamala Harris will be at her alma mater, Howard University, where she plans to celebrate with supporters. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump will host an election night watch party at the Palm Beach Convention Center in West Palm Beach, Florida. Now that we're all caught up, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Push the Next Generation, recommend it to a friend, follow on socials at Push the Next Generation Pod, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Okay, now that the begging is over, which is very on brand for a political podcast, let's get into it. This week, I'll be speaking with former U.S. Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr., who served in the U.S. House of Representatives for 17 years, where he championed racial, social, economic, and environmental justice from his influential position on the House Appropriations Committee. His post-congressional career has focused on teaching civil discourse and advancing new American rights through his writings and the establishment of the National Institute for the Study of the Public Religion of the United States. I have to also add that he's one of the most prolific constitutional scholars I know. Beyond his political legacy, Jesse is also my brother and a powerful voice actively creating the more perfect union our parents raised us to fight for. Now, heads up. This episode is a bit more historically inclined than most, as I felt it was an important framework for us to start from, but believe me, the vibes this season will be immaculate. I couldn't think of a more perfect guest to kick off this podcast. Welcome, Jesse Jr.
Hello! I am so excited to have you on. Obviously, everyone, this is a very special guest to me. This is my brother, so this is going to be a fun little conversation. But yeah, we got Jesse Jackson Jr. on Push the Next Generation. We love to see it.
Thanks, Ashley. It's great to be here.
One of the things that's been really interesting to me growing up in this space is that most people my age that I interact with have no understanding of Dad's importance in history, frankly. And so growing up, it took my mom and people like you and my dad to actually teach me a little bit more about my heritage and where I come from in that regard. But I'm just curious, because I think what's really important about Gen Z is we're very activated and want to be mobilized, but sometimes not having the context, and more than just reading books, not having the context and the feel of what was happening at a certain point in time puts us at kind of a disservice, I feel like. So for you, especially this time that we're in politically, I'd love to know if you could paint a picture for our audience of what it was like in America and in the world when Dad was running for office, because I really think that understanding that history could benefit us today.
So let me start by saying that I think you're asking the right question, right? You're not a coconut that just dropped from a tree.
I am not a coconut. Yeah.
So there is this period of reflection and research to put the life of our father, the life of other prominent figures in a particular context, and that matters. And so as I sit here with you, I reflect upon the history of our people from 1619 to the present, from 19 scared Africans who got off of a boat in Jamestown, Virginia, against their will. They had been captured, and their journey, their spirit, Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor said, is a spirit and a journey that has carried with all of us since the inception and pre-inception of our own country. So from 1619 to 1776, we were here. We were here in 1791 when the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. And we were here when Dred Scott was decided, when Kansas-Nebraska compromise took place. We watched our spirit energy did. The first African Americans come to Congress, and then we watched the Tilden Hayes Compromise of 1876-77, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, beginning Jim Crow until 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, until Emmett Till was killed. After that, Rosa Parks sat down. Dr. King came to her rescue, the Montgomery bus boycott, and from that, the second Reconstruction of the United States commenced with the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 68. I don't need a book to understand that I'm not a coconut that just fell out of a tree, that I'm part of a continuum of struggle, a continuum of history, and that we are under an obligation to know that history in ways that my generation, Generation X, Y, and Z may or may not know that history, but that history becomes informative about, for example, where we stand, where we sit on November 5th, 2024. And so just as I'm sitting here in a hotel room in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, out here on this campaign trail, I know this history, and it is this history that is innately a part of me, that is compelling my spirit, that in part comes from who our father is, and who at his best before his health, who our father was, to be able to pick up the mantle of that. We just can't struggle as a family and as siblings with entitlement because we're born to Jesse Jackson, because we're from our households, that somehow we're separate and apart from the history of Black people at every facet of their lives. And along that struggle, because of our unique vantage point, we can see the struggle of women. We can see the struggle of the LGBT community. We can see when women's rights are turned back over to the states, because we had our rights turned back over to the states. So we knowledge and an information, not only in domestic affairs, but global affairs, because after all, our people came here as part of a foreign policy called the slave trade. And that matters in our interpretive history and our interpretive viewpoints.
Absolutely. This is a really great, framework for a lot of people, because frankly, our education system in America is a little want at best some days. And so some people just don't have that context, which I think is really important. But specifically, before we pivot, I recognize that this is the 40th year since the 40th anniversary since Dad ran for office in 84. And I remember being, I think it was last year when Vice President Harris, when Dad announced his retirement, was speaking about that level of impact of seeing that campaign. And we've seen former President Barack Obama address the formative experience for these people coming up into politics, these Black people having these opportunities, and people of all different marginalized backgrounds, like what it was like in 84 for this individual to show up, demand, and I don't want to say demand to be seen, but demand for others to also be seen. Like, what was that like for you? I think you were in your early 20s at that point, just from your vantage point, to set the stage for people to understand why this particular campaign now that we're seeing with Harris is so monumental.
It was a pivotal moment of courage. It was a pivotal moment of courage for the future, that Jesse Jackson would stand up and say, "Here I am, send me." And so much of that is tied to his rearing in 1941, when he was born in Greenville, South Carolina, and the rejection that he experienced. I am somebody is not, his self-affirmation is not just a self-affirmation. It is the self-affirmation of a people, that they matter when they were told they did not matter. And so when Jesse Jackson enters the race in 84 and begins, I am somebody, he begins with, our votes should not be taken for granted, that he understood we were the party of Thomas Jefferson. He understood that we were the party of Jefferson Davis. He understood that we were the party of George Wallace. But because of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and public accommodations legislation, because of the sacrifice of Martin Luther King Jr. and the witness of Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks and others, that we took over the Democratic Party and redefined, Lincoln redefined what it meant to be an American on July 4th, 1863. We defined the old Democratic Party, separated it from who it was, to the Democratic Party of Jesse Jackson, the Democratic Party of Barack Obama, the Democratic Party of Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic Party of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and quite frankly, the Democratic Party that gave us Ketanji Brown Jackson on the Supreme Court of the United States. And so it is in recognizing the continuity of that struggle that I think we find our purpose. And I think that you're seeing some young cats like the young men who stood up in Tennessee. You're seeing the sisters who led the movement for Black Lives Matter after George Floyd. You're seeing it in young students and young people like yourselves who are asserting themselves, but also learning the history, understanding the history, and fighting for a context that legitimizes themselves in their space so that they can speak authentically about the experience of our people and literally earn the spirit energy that was with 19 scared Africans who came to these shores in Jamestown, Virginia, and they simply said, give us free. We want to be free. And so that spirit of freedom is something that burns, I think, deep within us.
I think that is so powerful.
It potentially burns within each of us until we activate it, until the seed is planted and we bring it forward. I think I had to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's really powerful to have this framework, especially going into this podcast. I think that for me, I've seen particularly the disconnect when we are lacking the context as a generation. It really does put us at a deficit to conversations, and we are now a voting bloc. We are now joining the electorate, and making sure that we are armed with this level of knowledge, I think, is like paramount to us being able to see the progression that we'd like to see. We're one of the most progressive generations we've seen, and like, what does that look like if you're not connected to your past?
You know, Ash, when I got to Congress, and I served 17 years in the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House was Newt Gingrich. And this was not a young man. This is a gentleman with a full head of white hair, but he was a historian. And the legislation that he was offering and passing, and the Republican majority at the time, they were offering legislation based on their understanding of history. Now, if we're going to offer new laws, new thinking, new appropriations on the basis of our understanding of our history, or we're not. And if some young person who has studied the history is able to make the case, of course we feel lost, because we come with the energy, we come with the enthusiasm, we come with the will, but the language that they're using is a language that we don't understand, and we end up joining the Democratic Party in its current form, whatever manifestation that is. We join the Republican Party in its current form, or whatever manifestation it is, but we don't identify necessarily as legitimate, authentic leaders of a people who came here against their will. And we have to do that.
Absolutely. So speaking of your time in Congress, first, I would just love to know, because again, speaking of history and all the things, what accomplishments you're most proud of during that tenure in Congress, and how they impacted your constituents' lives.
So I'm excited about a lot of things that I did in Congress. Number one, most of the things that I did, in addition to appropriating more than $2 billion to my congressional district, all public funds, water projects, highways, roads, in communities that had no representation ever on the Appropriations Committee, I was able to make some amazing things happen in 17 years. But because of my knowledge of history, when I walked in Statuary Hall and saw Robert statue and Jefferson Davis's statue and Alexander Hamilton Stevens' statue and all of these Confederate statues, when Rosa Parks died, I passed legislation, offered legislation, got bipartisan support. And I said, right here in this statuary hall, we're going to put Rosa Parks a statue
Mhm.
and honor her memory for her contribution for defining the republic. As opposed to fighting to change the name of the largest room in the Capitol of the United States, the Capitol Visitor Center, by the way, the only way millions of tourists visit the Capitol is to go through security in the
Right.
Capitol
In the
Visitor Center.
visitor center. Yep.
I insisted that it not be named Liberty Hall. I insisted that it be named Emancipation Hall.
Yeah.
You walk into the Capitol of the United States, you walk into the idea, not of liberty, you walk into the idea of emancipation, and that required legislation signed by George Bush and co-sponsored by me and Congressman Zach Wamp, who was a Republican, because we wanted to make this statement and this contribution together. In addition to the things that I did publicly, I made my own share of errors. I went to prison for 30 months because I was raised in Chicago. I have a home in Chicago. I got married in Chicago. But when I got elected, I ended up in Washington, D.C., and I needed another house. And then the kids came. And so it got very expensive. I lived in my campaign funds to the tune of about $75,000 a year above my salary because I lived in two cities. I saw living in Washington as a business expense. So I didn't use public funds. I used I raised and I appropriated them for personal use to my own demise. I was sentenced to 30 months in a federal prison, and it's not something I'm particularly proud of, but it was a lesson learned, and it was a path that I had to experience and I had to endure. And I give a lot of people a lot of advice now about how not to follow that particular path.
I think it's really important that you've brought that up, actually, and I have 20 more questions to ask you about Congress. But to pivot really quickly to the federal prison system, I would love to know from you what specific reforms you feel are most urgently needed in our criminal justice system, particularly as they relate to nonviolent offenders.
I think the most significant reality is that 77 million men and women have paid their debt to society. They believe in America. They did what the judge said do. They didn't run. They didn't escape. They didn't kill themselves. They didn't move to another country and avoid justice. They were caught, captured, pled guilty. They all paid their debt to society. And after they paid their debt to society, most of us have spent more time being felons than we have the time that was given to us by the jury and the judge. I did 30 months in prison, but I've been a felon for 10 years because the constitutional schema of our country suggests, certainly at the federal constitution, that the president of the United States functions in the lineage of David for all of the American people. And at the end of a federal sentence, there ought to be forgiveness granted to us. And if you think about people who've gotten forgiveness, like Richard Nixon, I didn't do it, and he didn't do no time, but he got pardoned. When I think about other Black men and women and white men and white women and Hispanic men and Hispanic women who don't have the name Jackson or don't have the name Hunter Biden, and the likelihood that we may be considered for pardon, and that 77 million men and women who, just like us, offended, paid their debt to society, may not be available for pardon because they can't afford a lawyer, don't have a famous name, don't have a famous dad, don't have political clout. It is shameful that at the end of that journey, the pardon isn't available to them, both at the federal level and the 50 governors using the pardon power to restore people to the life, liberty, and happiness system with their full rights. This is the biggest problem because the entire industry of second chances is unnecessary if we live in a redemptive society that grants the grace of God and the forgiveness of God to the American people after they offend. But our Democratic and Republican politics, somehow it seems like we just can't do it until right before we leave office. And then if we don't do it right before we leave office, then the person's sentence has been extended in felonization. But if we do it while we're in office, well, maybe we can't get reelected again because someone's going to run a nasty commercial about the people that we let out of prison, but you didn't let anybody out of prison. I'm talking about the debt paid offender, People who are in prison need to finish doing their time. They need to do what the judge said do and what the jury said do for what they did do. I'm discussing people like me and others who've gotten out of prison and are still trying to get a job. That's ridiculous. And I needed to see that. And the system needed me to experience it because I have no problem being the system spokesperson for what's wrong and the treatment of people. If Kamala Harris wins, great. I'm excited about that. I've already voted for her. If she loses, she will lose not because she wasn't joyful or because she wasn't happy. She will lose by the margin in all of these states that Joe Biden and Harris did not restore these men and women to their full citizenship rights and give them a new life. And that's what the pardon power was intended to do. In fact, it is the only democracy in human history out of 194 constitutions that have been written to emulate our Constitution where there's something in it called the finger of God. We just rarely see it exercised.
That is so powerful. And I also just want to note for people, because I think we've recently witnessed the horrific murder, state-sanctioned murder of Marcellus Williams. And like the prison system is complex in the justice system, rather, is also complex in the fact that there are innocent people who are behind bars as well. And that's not who you were referring to. I just want to over clarify because some people will start conflating issues, and let's just not have that happen. So I was like, there's no need to have a headline about that. Speaking just really briefly about this one more time. So I'd love to know what insights you can share with our Gen Z audience about the realities of incarceration beyond like rehabilitation, which we've kind of addressed, just because I feel like, you know, the sentencing guidelines, prison conditions, reintegration programs. I would just love to know your thoughts on what we could be doing to activate and mobilize for people who are deserving of second chances, et cetera.
Well, first of all, know the law. And if you can, avoid this process entirely. Let me say that because it will bankrupt you. My marriage did not survive it. I'm still working on strengthening relationships with my own children because it changes things. It changes friends. It changes relationships. It changes family. Everybody thinks they can get away with something until they can't get away with it, right? And so I didn't feel that I was living outside of my means. I didn't feel that way. Lots of members of Congress can't afford from Hawaii to California to fly 12 and 15 hours to DC to get there. And suddenly, not only do you have a home in Hawaii, expensive real estate, or in California, now you have to have a place to stay in DC, and that comes out of your own pocket. Well, for me, I've concluded it doesn't come out of my own pocket. So Don't do it. I'd rather now live in my office, sleep on my couch, than rather than have a place in DC. No, I can't afford. I'm not a millionaire. Actually, we have a big name, but we don't have any money. So let me first start by saying and discouraging young people from thinking they're slick, from thinking they can get away with it, from thinking you can go to a party and do whatever you want, and then 10 years later, your behavior not show back up, and someone remembers seeing you at the party, and now you need a lawyer to explain what you did or did not do at the party because you thought you were having a good time. Now, that isn't the biggest lesson for your generation. I don't know what is. Without mentioning any names. That's just how you can get caught up. And so picking your friends, staying on a righteous path, being committed to service, following the instructions of your parents is 90% of what you ought do to avoid the small chance that you could be picked out of a crowd and find yourself in a lifelong process that none of your planning can anticipate or imagine. So, I mean, it's hell. If there's hell on earth next to death, prison is it. The incarceration process, the post-incarceration process, we can talk about the sentencing guidelines. We can talk about every aspect of I can grab one thing and focus on all of the criminal justice system from that one point, the appellate process. But the fact of the matter is all of it is avoidable if you avoid it. And we don't have to deal with that. There's no one thing that can fix the process except for the restoration of your life when you've gone through it. And that requires the forgiveness of God. And that forgiveness was extracted and placed in the Constitution of the United States. It is rarely exercised, but the fact that it's in our Constitution, it ought to be exercised for everybody. Give everyone a new life. You don't see it when you're in it, but then it happens. And then you're trying to explain and justify your character when you're trying to get out of it. And that, my friend, my sister, is hell on earth.
Yeah.
Avoid it.
Very much avoiding it. And I hope that people really take heed to what you're saying right now, because it's not like he's scolding you individuals in my generation, because that's not what the vibe is. It's really like, as someone who has gone through this process, both behind bars and afterwards, warning you against what we all understand to be an American nightmare. But this is from speaking from someone who has actually been through the process. So I really hope that we understand that, and also that we keep fighting for reform, and we keep fighting to ensure that people are pardoned, and making sure that felons in all 50 states are able to vote. Like all of these things are just like that should be absolutely a given.
Now, I'm going to be clear. Debt paid felons.
Debt paid felons. Yes, I will.
I'm talking about people who are in jail. There's some pretty dangerous people in jail. They have a lot of time and they need to do their time. They got a lot of work to do. I'm talking about people who did, who paid their debt. They did what the judge said do. They did what the jury said do, and they're out now. Let me give you one last example. I did a radio show not long ago, Ash, and a gentleman called in by the name of Larry. He got tickets from our brother to visit the White House from his congressman. Mm-hmm. And he went to the White House. He said he waited in a 2.5 or 3 hour line to get to security with his young daughter. He went through security after having given them his name and indicated the time that he was supposed to be there, which he was on time. He said, "My name is Larry." So they said, "Larry, if you could just sit right over here and have a seat, we'll be with you in just a minute." They said, "Larry, we can't let you in the White House." He said, "Why? I'm here with my 13-year-old daughter." He said, the Secret Service agent said, "Because when we ran your name, you committed an offense 40 years ago." They wouldn't let him in the White House. His 13-year-old daughter could go on her tour, but she couldn't go with her daddy. He said he was so embarrassed and humiliated, he decided he wasn't going to vote for Joe Biden any longer. He's going to vote Republican.
Oh, my God.
So they reached back for a man who hasn't offended in 40 years and slapped him in the face with it. And it's real.
Yeah.
It's real time and real painful stuff.
We talk a lot about this notion of like Christian nationalism right now in society. I feel like there's like a deep undercurrent. I mean, we've seen some of the most, I'm just going to call them weird rallies supporting Trump, almost as if he's a messiah, and this kind of messianic rhetoric. And I think it's important to clarify here the difference between what someone might go like, oh, when Jesse Jr. is referring to the finger of God, he's suggesting that we need to be a Christian nation. Like, I think I need you to help distill that thought down for people so that they don't go running with ideas that's unclear.
So one of the things that I discovered while in prison is that there is a deep theological experiment in the Constitution of the United States. There is a theological underpinning in the Constitution. Is it a Christian theological underpinning? I don't think so. Is it a Muslim theological underpinning? I don't think so. Is it a Judeo-Christian theological underpinning? I'm not quite clear on whether it is or not. But what I can share with you is that there is something, according to Alexander Hamilton, in the New York Advertiser on October 17th, 1787, just 30 days after the Constitution, he writes, "For my part, I sincerely esteem the Constitution, a system which without the finger of God could have never been devised upon the diversity of interests." That's a quote. So Hamilton, 30 days after the Constitution, is saying there's something in the Constitution called the finger of God. In Federalist number 37, James Madison says it is impossible for a man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of that almighty hand, which is signally responsible for the rebellion. So James Madison says there's a finger of God in the Constitution. So what is the religion that's in the Constitution? The religion is the sect of one. It's there as a function. It says essentially that the most significant and highest form of religion in the world is Ashley Jackson's personal relationship with God. It's Jesse Jr.'s personal relationship with God. Before congregationalism and denominationalism, before the church came into existence, their argument is that Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, David, and Jesus are in a religion with God by themselves. And that the president of the United States, when they assume that role for all of the people, for all 50 states, for all 3,000 counties, for all 350 million American people, is going to end up in a contemplation in a religion by themselves to make decisions for the people. So they extracted from the linear theological system the commander of the army and militia. That's the character of David. And reprieves and pardons, the character of Jesus. David and Jesus. David and Jesus. Commander of the army and militia and reprieves and pardons. They extract it as a function for one person to perform. But from David to Jesus, there are 28 generations, so you can't say it's two job responsibilities. We're supposed to be electing a human being of character from the linear theological system who will do what? Provide all of his people with health care, all of her people with a clean, safe, and sustainable environment, with decent housing, with a job, with decent, equal, high quality education. We're electing someone who represents us at the highest level of faith. And when they put this function in the Constitution, this was their faith in the Constitution, that each generation of Americans would find a person of that character. And on September 17th, 1787, they were not a Democrat. That didn't happen until 1793. And they weren't a Republican. That didn't happen until 1854. On September 17th, 1787, that person was to function in the lineage of David for the people. And that's what transformed my inglorious prison experience, where I found this, into something glorious and my new purpose.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, and I think what I gather from that in terms of kind of distilling it down for our generation, and not the concept itself, because I think you just distilled it down in the best way possible, but this notion where I think we are a generation that has been raised on the internet in many ways, and so we're often raised in clickbait and raised in headlines and raised in quick thinking, and we see a word that stands out and we run with it. And so I think it's important to have this framework so that people understand that you are literally not suggesting, you're almost suggesting the opposite of imposing religion on people.
Yeah. In fact, I've written a book on this subject. It is available on Amazon. It's called The Finger of God, from functioning from the lineage of David to the presidency of the United States. It is a very, very well-documented book. I would encourage the clickbait crowd to read it. Like I share with you, this stuff comes from a space of scholarship.
Right.
A space of thinking. That's what motivates us. That's what inspires us. It's just not an idea. It's not just a quote. It's really something that answer the question, Gen Z, for yourself. Do you think the founding fathers established their faith in Congress? Is that the source of their eternal inspiration? Is the Senate, copied after the Roman Empire, the source of their eternal inspiration? Is the idea of a president the source of their eternal inspiration? Is the Supreme Court, the processes of our government and these branches, the source of their eternal inspiration? No. The source of their internal and eternal infinite inspiration is a supreme being, God. How did they handle the question of God in the Constitution? Did they call him Allah? Did they call him Yahweh? Did they call him or her Jesus? Did they call him or her Buddha? No. From the linear theological system, they took the function of heaven on earth. If someone could get elected whose spirit was consistent with their faith, they would do mighty things on behalf of the people, a form of, if you will, discipleship to these systems. And that's what they did. And that's why for people who are not of pious reflection, it's difficult for them to see it and find it. But I had plenty of time in prison to figure it out.
Plenty of time. Okay, this is really, really good stuff. And I think, speaking of this, I'd like to talk about, it's looking like this episode is going to launch the day before our presidential election in 2024. So the people that are listening to it the day before will either have a really fun time on the 5th listening to it, and frankly, we're not even going to know the results on the 5th, I doubt. So it might be a very stressful episode to hear or not. And I would love to know your predictions, and not in terms of hey, predict the election, but what you see happening in the country right now, where you think we're headed, regardless of who's at the helm, because frankly, I'm a little nervous either way, while I do hope VP Harris wins.
Let me try and summarize it for you this way. I'm in a hotel room right now in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. My car broke down. I should be on the campaign trail. I've been in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania. I'm in Pennsylvania. I'm going to North Carolina. I'm going to Atlanta as soon as my car is fixed, right? So I'm in a hotel room. And I spoke in Gettysburg. And I walked the battlefield. So this is what I would share with them as quickly and as succinctly as I possibly can. The first 87 July 4ths are unimaginable for your generation and my generation. From 1776 to 1863, those 87 July 4ths where only white male landowners had something to say in this republic are unimaginable. But from July 4th, 1863, the day after Gettysburg, to July 4th, 2024, there have been 161 July 4ths. Some of them have witnessed heroic events. Some of them on those July 4ths have experienced horrific events.
Mm-hmm.
The nation was in mourning in World War I and World War II and Korea and Vietnam and the death of Dr. King. The July 4ths that followed those events were not as exciting as we turned our attention to our war dead and to the loss of Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy and Dr. King. Those July 4ths were sad.
Mm-hmm.
On the ballot is what kind of July 4th we will have in 2025. We're either going to extend it where young women and other Americans see Reconstruction being expanded with Kamala Harris an American possibility. Or on July 4th, 2025, you will watch immigrants being shipped out of the country. You will watch Project 2025 being debated in the Congress. You will watch the borders closed. You will watch potentially someone who doesn't even want to leave the White House. You will be watching some of all of that on July 4th, 2025, if you don't participate in this process. Mm-hmm. This is why your generation has to be connected to this history. What do the next 161 July 4ths look like? 1776? Or what we were becoming on July 4th, 1863? That's why the history matters.
Absolutely. And, there's 41 million of us who are eligible in Gen Z alone. That's not even including millennials in Gen Z eligible, which means over 18 to vote in this election. And I saw a recent NBC News poll that said that I believe between 53 or 58% of us were saying that we were absolutely voting, which rounded out to around 23 million. I really hope that number is higher. When I look at knowing that we are the most diverse generation in this nation's history coming forth, and the most liberal leaning, which I think is normal, I think for a lot of younger generations to be liberal, but we are skewing very liberal, over 70% liberal, what it looks like to be a voting bloc in today's space, and to know that there are issues that we're really concerned about. We're really concerned about climate change. We're really concerned about reproductive freedom. We're really concerned about gun reform and gun control. And I'm just wondering from you, as someone who has served in our nation's government, what you think the future will look like with us at the helm, and if there's any words of encouragement you would give to us beyond us looking at our history, because we've definitely spent a good 45 discussing that. Yeah.
So the question for me is, what are you fighting for? You gave me some evidence of that in what you just said. But one generation added a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution in less than 5 years. What amendment are you all fighting for?
Mm-hmm.
That's if you back into that process, it will tell you that you need 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states, which means you need a Gen Z organization that big and a Congress that big just to pass the language that you want in the Constitution to save the environment.
Mm.
What language do you want? You believe in climate change? You believe in it as something that the Supreme Court can overturn? How does that help the environment? How does that sustain itself? You believe in it as a piece of legislation offered by liberals in Congress? How does that sustain itself when Congress, after it passes, if it passes, decides not to fund it?
Yeah.
What is the best use of your life? To add a constitutional amendment to the Constitution saying that all citizens shall enjoy the right to a clean, safe, and sustainable environment. That's the first language. The second part of it says, and the Congress shall have the power to implement this article by appropriate legislation because 50 different states, 3,300 different counties alone can't do it. States' rights can't save the environment. It must make it a human right. So when Ashley in California says, I don't like this dump, you have a legal right to go into court and sue where the dump is occurring. You don't know what the environmentals are in Mississippi or Alabama. You must empower the people of Alabama through the Constitution to be able to say, well, we know what they are. So we're going to court and we're demanding that the court force Congress to fix this problem. In other words, we need more eyes, more ears, more voices into the debate in the legal system because you now have a constitutional right that must be enforced. And that's the best use of your time the rest of your life. Because you and I today and your generation, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, are the beneficiaries of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Every citizen that comes to this country is the benefit of a struggle they did not participate in themselves. So we have to plant the seed and lay the groundwork for future generations to have the legal basis upon which they challenge the entire system nonviolently to bring about the change that's necessary that we desire. And it's not just that. We all also ought to have the constitutional right to health care of equal high quality, which is not the same as the constitutional right to an equal rights amendment for women. We probably need them both. Equal rights amendment for women would settle the abortion question, but so would the constitutional right to health care of equal high quality, meaning it's between you and your doctor what you do with your body. All of these matter, but fight for them as constitutional rights, not just as legislation.
I think that is so powerful because I speak to a lot of members of our generation and everyone wants to do something. We want to get involved. We see things and we don't like things the way that they are and we want to change them. But figuring out the best mode of mobilization oftentimes is where we get kind of caught up. And so hearing from you, which I mean, I would consider you a constitutional scholar amongst many other things, and a former congressman, like hearing that this is a way that we can actually impart meaningful change and really get the things that we want to see in our future kind of actually implemented, I think is really beautiful and something that I really hope we can all walk away with. Because I mean, the first time that, and I hate to say this because I have read a lot of history books, but the first time that it really sunk into me what the Equal Rights Amendment was about was watching TV. Actually, I was watching Madam Secretary, I believe. I'm pretty sure that was a show because I'm a political TV show junkie. And they were addressing that issue in the context of like me watching it being like, wow, that's interesting. And then I was like, oh, that hasn't really passed. Like, I'm so confused, like all of these things. And so that was my understanding of where I came to it from, understanding what the power of amendments and what they can look like in modern society today in terms of us enacting them. And hearing that from you really, I hope, imparts upon other people who have not really heard this rhetoric and this kind of dialogue before to look at like, okay, there are a lot of things that we're not going to like. And I think one of the other things I would love to talk to you about is like this notion of single issue voters. Because I think, you know, it's complex, right? Yes, there are single issues that we vote for. I am voting for my freedom in this election. Like there are single issues that we vote for, but what it looks like when we're up against like, okay, maybe you don't like every single thing
that Kamala Harris has to offer you. I'm not going to be able to persuade you of the 20 things that you think that she might have done wrong. But what does it look like when we're trying to address harm mitigation? And like, what does it look like when we want to have the opportunity to advocate for things that we don't want to have happen in the next 10, 15 years? Like, I want to be able to buy a home. I want to be able to have children and not be concerned that I'm going to die in the hospital. Like, you know what I'm kind of asking, if you get the vibe?
So Raphael Warnock, Reverend Raphael Warnock, Senator Raphael Warnock says that a vote is a kind of prayer that you cast for the world that you want to build. Now, it ought to be a comprehensive prayer. It ought not just be, Lord, I'm voting. No, it's like, I want a job. I want civil rights. I want protections. I want good schools. I want healthcare. When I cast my vote, I bring all of this history to the vote when I cast it. I didn't just vote for Kamala or vote for alternative. When I came to vote, and I have voted, I brought everything that we've talked about to my one vote when I said Kamala Harris. Donald Trump can't handle the conversation I just had with you. His mind is too fickle, too feeble, and too short-sighted, and not very well educated or disciplined. He can't handle this conversation. So Gen Z gets to bring to they are the sum of all of history. And so for single-issue voters, it's like, who goes to the grocery store and just buys grease? I mean, you got to get fish, you got salad, something green, you got to get some laundry detergent. I mean, but, you go to one cash registrar, or you slide it through the scanner yourself and store. So you don't go shopping usually for one item. It's usually a day that you go shopping for lots of things. So it's like, I bring all of these things with me to the vote.
Right.
For those people who can sit back and grab a single issue, it actually shows a lack of certainty, a lack of understanding of all of the history. Now, let me try and say it this way. People who are gone are gone. We don't know who's coming in the future or what the future holds.
Right.
What, Ashley, is that all of history is about you. All of history is about your friends. All of history is about everyone who is alive in the present. From the beginning of time, everything is about you. And you may choose to read no books, which is how they transfer information to you. May choose not to listen to Beethoven and Chopin and Tchaikovsky. You may choose just to listen to hip hop. But all of this belongs to you because you are the sum of it. All of us are part of a process, and your generation has to see themselves as more responsible than just that. Healthcare is on the ballot. Education's on the ballot. Student loans are on the ballot. Your next job is on the ballot, whether it's here or whether it's in China, it's on the ballot. Criminal justice is on the ballot, whether you get stopped and frisked or get harassed when you go out with your friends, all that's on the ballot. And you got one vote, a kind of prayer that you get to cast over the character of the individual who will say, I don't want what just happened to them to happen to anybody else.
Well, I have I want to say two last quick questions for you. And then we have this thing where we have a member of Gen Z ask a question directly to the guest, because I didn't want me to become the voice of Gen Z. I wanted us to be able to all be in dialogue with guests. So I'll have that young man ask a question in a moment. But two quick questions for you. One came up because, speaking of just social media, and I mean, we've seen the impact of social media in very positive ways in this campaign, and also very, very horrific ways in the spread of misinformation and just straight lies. And one of the lies that I would like to clarify today, which I don't know that we've ever really clarified before, and we'll see if this makes it to air. But the thing that I've seen a lot on TikTok sometimes is you'll see pictures of Donald Trump, people like our father, for instance, or people who are incredibly progressive. And then there's this assumption that, one, we are somehow backing everything that he believes in, and two, that I don't know, there's just a notion that I think we need to just clarify what Donald Trump was of yesteryear and what he is today, and why.
Well, he's the same person today that he was yesteryear, except for we didn't understand that he was lying to us. He was a Democrat. He was supporting Democrats. He believed in democratic causes. He was supportive of Reverend. He was supportive of others who were fighting for inclusion on Wall Street. Now, he was lying to us. We've been lied to. We're victims. Should we sue? We The lawyer for the misappropriation of our images, for having known Donald. He's a liar. Now we know
Yeah.
we don't hang around rapists. Now we know he's a felon. We don't try to hang around him, but he needs to pay his debt to society like the rest of us have. We didn't know he was a crook. We didn't know he was a grifter.
We didn't know he was a absolute racist and fascist.
We didn't know none of that. So when he ran for president, as a business person, think about it. As a business person, why would he lead with, "I don't like you"? He always,
Right.
"I want to do a deal with you. I think we can do this together. I think this makes sense for the economy." That's what they do. Now he runs for president and he shows us who he really is. He's a racist. He's a pathological liar. He is a sick human being. He's not well. That's who he is. We didn't know that then. And his symptoms were not then what they are now. This is not a well man. And so that's the truth.
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify it, not just coming from me, but I think like in this era where we're trying to, you know, decode misinformation and figure out what's truth and what's false. No, there is no conspiracy theory that my dad supports Trump, that our dad supports Trump, because like the math just doesn't math. Also, if we want to really get into it, Donald Trump was absolutely writing.
Ashley and I are trying to get our dad to support us, and he ain't got no time to support Trump.
He sure doesn't. Our dad literally, our dad has.
We're on his phone. Yeah, we're on his phone. Dad, we
like, can
I
hold $1? No, it's, I mean, I think it's really also just beautiful to see for me, the fact that like people are always asking me, how's your dad doing? How's your dad doing? I know you get those calls all the time too. And, you know, dad has Parkinson's and he's navigating. But what's been really, really, really beautiful for me to see is him on this trail supporting Vice President Harris, and not necessarily with his words and his oratory in the ways that he might have done in the past. But this is such a part of who he is, that there's not a world in which he would just be sitting at home, even still in the wheelchair, not even being able to give a big speech in the way that he wants to, but his presence is valuable. And I know that you've been with him on the trail, and it's just really, it fills me with joy knowing that he's able to express himself in that way on the trail.
But his spirit is insatiable, and
Yeah.
he understands the gravity of the hour. And I'm so grateful that, you know, he's showing us not only in his life, but at the stage of his life, just how committed and how concerned he is for your generation.
Yeah.
And these are hard fought battles. They don't just happen overnight. They've taken time to get us where we are. And it's the idea that we could lose it in such a short period of time has got to be overwhelming for him. So, you know, he'll be in Atlanta, I understand, on Tuesday, because he wants to be, you know,
We're in a room where it happens.
To be in the room where it happens.
I'm going to let our guest, Gen Zer, come in and ask a quick question to you.
My name is Alan Williams. I'm from Florida. I'm studying media production, and talking about the election, what would you say to people who are involved in sports and politics, whether that's media, and what would you say to them about getting involved in political conversations?
Well, let me begin by thanking him for his question. I think we have a civic duty. I think we have a moral responsibility. I think that the price that we're going to pay as Americans is an eternal vigilance for our rights, for our freedoms, and our democracy. And inherent in his question about athletes and others who want to be involved or engaged, I mean, these are sanctioned sports by the law. And there was a time when African Americans couldn't play baseball. I mean, there's Jackie Robinson. There was a time when we couldn't attend public universities. That's Brown versus the Board of Education. And so the diversity of education, the diversity of our lives, economically, politically, and socially, is all because of changes in the law. And so we have an obligation to tear down these old barriers, to keep new ones from being erected, so that we can move beyond a segregated society to a truly integrated society. And I don't mean just integrated by race, I mean integrated by concern for neighbor, being able to share with our neighbor our pain, and our neighbor being able to share with us their pain. And we really pull these pain patches together, and we end up forging a new identity. The American people are the only people in the world who come here from Ireland and Italy and Africa. Some come by migrant ship, some come by slave ship, some come across the border, some come from the Oriental to the Occidental. We are the only people in human history who represent these diversity of backgrounds who are called to be a single people, the American people. We are a people unto ourselves. And for most Americans, it's almost impossible to return home, to return to their places of origin and not recognize the fact, I'm really not from here. I like Netflix. I like highway. I like America. You know, I don't agree with everything that's going on, but I am an American. And we ought to be able together to sing one day, my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee we sing. We are towards being a single people. We're not there yet.
Oh, that was a wonderful answer. Thank you, Alan, for asking that question. And thank you to my brother for being my first guest on Push the Next Generation. This is very exciting. I love this for us. Any final words you would want to impart on to members of Gen Z as we prepare for what is honestly the fight of our lives, in my opinion, as we, get ready for battle?
I want to congratulate you on your new show. Hey, Gen Z, Ashley's my leader. I'm 50. Oh, I'm out of here. And Ashley is the very best of our family and the very best that my father has ever produced. And so I'm just glad to be allied with her. And I'll be on as often as she wants to assist her in any questions that I, based on almost 6 decades of experience, might be able to provide some answers or some direction to. Congratulations, Ashley.
Thank you, big brother. Well, that was a fun one. If you want to submit a question to our guests, DM at Push the Next Generation Pod on Instagram for a chance to make it onto future episodes. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Push the Next Generation, recommend it to a friend, follow on socials at Push the Next Generation Pod, and thank you so much for watching and listening. See you next week on Push the Next Generation. In the meantime, be good to yourselves. This is Ashley Jackson signing off.